With Lorwyn Eclipsed about to hit an LGS shelf near you, what better time to talk all about Typal decks? Yes, that's right, decks filled with all of Magic's silliest little goobers. In this video, I'm going to yap about some grievances that I have with the average Typal deck, and then about how we can fix those to make these decks better, more interesting, and more fun. It's also not by accident that I've chosen to talk about this alongside the release of Lorwyn Eclipsed, and we'll also look at how it specifically helps to address some of the big frustrations that I have with these decks. A big thank you to Magic the Gathering for sponsoring this video and enabling all my amphibian kindred contemplations. Now this video wouldn't exist if I didn't have some bones to pick with your favorite little goober deck, so let's get right into my criticisms. My first issue with most kindred or Typal decks is they default to a fairly basic strategy. One that over a series of turns aims to play many of a type of creature, and then gets more of that type of creature, and then pumps them up or makes them unblockable to kill everyone. And to make matters worse, almost every Typal deck of a certain type is going to be nearly identical. Play against one Elves deck, or Merfolk deck, one Goblin deck, and you've probably played against most of them. Now this is obviously a sweeping generalization, but I imagine that you likely have had decks like this, have friends who have decks like this right now, or still have decks like this yourself. There is definitely no shame in this, but a generic strategy of turn creatures sideways is the most basic way of playing Magic, and this is why most of us have one of these sitting on our shelf of shame right now. Or worse yet, have had these decks move from the shelf of shame to the deck deconstruction pipeline. And this brings me to my second issue. As we grow as players, most of us want continued novelty. We've played the creatures, we've made them big, and we've turned them sideways. And we've done that enough times that we start to want something else. We grow to want new experiences with more interesting interactions, more explosive plays, and more diverse win conditions that don't all die to a board wipe before we get to untap to use them. Often these experiences will also lead us to slightly higher power levels, which is a place where the average Typal deck really struggles to keep up. Most Typal decks limit our ability to have these new experiences because the shell of the deck is actually pretty rigid. We need upwards of 30 or more of a creature type to make the deck function either mechanically or thematically. And that's before we even think about working in some of the other stuff that we need, like removal, card draw, or ramp. Often the cards for these areas of our deck get narrowed down to a fairly small group that are reused across all the decks that share a color. And this creates a situation where kindred decks of the same type, and even different types, can end up feeling very samey. The main way that a deck like this then achieves individuality, uniqueness, or whimsy by the creatures that are included. But increasingly, creatures of different types are starting to look a lot like the same guy wearing different disguises. Don't get me wrong, different creature types still do vastly different things, like elves making a ton of mana, or goblins typically making lots of goblins, but how these two different types usually end up winning often feels pretty similar. And all of this means that exploring other strategies like Spellslinger, Combo, or Control becomes quite difficult to do. Not impossible, but definitely not easy. This links to my last major grievance, and that is that Typal decks are obviously tied to a game plan that relies on creatures. Some of Magic's most interesting and skill-expressive decks are filled with and rely on artifacts, enchantments, instants, sorceries, and these decks' reliance on creatures greatly limit us from employing those strategies. Despite all these frustrations, I still think that Typal decks have a place in our deck collections, and there are some things that I really like about them. They can make for really great introductions into Magic and first Commander deck experiences. They're thematic, easy to understand, and typically not too technically demanding for newer or casual players. Hell, if you're a casual player and you get in maybe a few games a month or even less often, you may well be perfectly happy with this experience and never grow bored of it. If that's the case, that makes me very happy. By extension, these decks are great things to break out as a more experienced player when introducing our friends to the game or when playing casual games with newer players. I think as a more experienced player, it's very easy to end up playing decks that are thoroughly confusing for new players, and if we're trying to get them to have a good time, playing an easy to understand and fairly linear deck greatly helps. The fact that these decks are often filled with cute themes and even cuter little guys, be that cats, dogs, squirrels, of course frogs, elves, or goblins if you're feeling a bit feral, or greatly help if you're trying to lure others, perhaps especially partners, into playing this delightful, yet otherwise intimidating and complicated game. On the opposite end of the spectrum, and in contrast with my grievances, certain specific kindred archetypes and decks can in certain cases perform well at higher powers. In recent years, creature types like dragons, merfolk, and dinosaurs have all received a lot of support, making them capable of leveling up. Squirrels have a few infinite combos up their furry sleeves, though those wins often feel very unsquirrel-like, and elves have always had quite explosive power. And then of course there's slivers, which have a very well-earned reputation. Some kindred decks being able to keep up on a power level certainly isn't a reason to like these decks over other decks, but they are a redeeming quality when most of these decks operate better at the lower end of the power scale. Now, despite having both a dinosaur and a dragon deck, this is where my affection for the average Typal deck ends. Most are too basic, too rigid, and too samey. But not all decks are created equal, and it's time to get to the meat and bones of this, which is how to make your collection of thematic little creatures go from average to an absolute banger. Firstly, I would suggest not simply thinking of your deck as a deck, but rather think of it as an experience. I've talked before about how there are benefits thinking about a Commander game a little bit like a D&D session, and this is even more true for a themed deck. Typal decks are after all at their core a themed Magic deck, and leaning into theme will make your deck far more interesting and unique. This also plays well with the fact that most of these decks have a power ceiling, because normally when making a deck more thematic we've got to trade power in response. But here with Typal decks we're probably playing in bracket 2 and at most bracket 3 to begin with, and that leaves lots of rooms to theme out our deck while still staying competitive. Let's use my bracket 3 dinosaur deck as a way to explore theming. When the Lost Caverns of Ixalan rolled around, I, like a lot of other people, got a hankering to turn some large antediluvian creatures sideways. While most picked up a Pantlaza precon and upgraded the face off of it, something else caught my eye. When I was a kid, I fucking loved dinosaurs. Like, I had a suitcase full of real fossils, like dinosaurs. I was basically a mini Ross Geller from Friends. The first movie that I got to see in the cinema was fittingly Jurassic Park, so it has a big soft spot in my heart. I then saw that the one and only Ian Malcolm was being printed as a secret lair, and I knew what I had to do. While certainly not the most left field, my Ian-skinned Lathril deck is all about making eggs and then having my opponents break them, and having chaos ensue as we play a dinosaur lottery. Ian is a main character, so he enters the story early, so I have a bunch of ramp. And he has plot armor, so my deck has many ways to protect him. There's a few ways of teaching the table their hubris of trying to control nature definitely won't go unpunished. As the famous saying goes, life finds a way. I know, of course, lots of big dinosaurs. If you're familiar with some of my content, you'll know that I use methods like a 33-card deck or a character sheet to help drive theme and focus where needed. I'll link to both of those videos in the description. Whilst I'm still ending the game by turning big creatures sideways in my Ian deck, how we get there is a little bit different. It's a fun minigame of cracking eggs, and this minigame often happens on others' turns, adding a new dynamic to the game. This all adds to the thematic experience that I'm hoping to bring to the table. My opponents try to control the dinosaurs, and now they're coming back to get you. But what if we want to get more creative with our commander? Well, I think you shouldn't simply pick the most popular commander for the type of deck you're trying to build. If you're building goblins, don't automatically pick Krenko. If you're building dinosaurs, don't automatically pick Pantlaza. Atla pales in comparison to the popularity of both Pantlaza and Gishath, but is hardly a niche commander. Let's dig up some alternatives and explore some of the lesser played dinosaur commanders that can offer up different or improved Typal experiences. You could go for the more recent Jurassic Park offerings with Owen Grady and Blue. Most dinosaur decks don't have access to the color blue, that's going to create some novelty right there. I'll be greatly surprised if our opponents see either a Cresting Mosasaurus or a Nezahal Primal Tide coming their way. If you're instead in the mood for a fight, Waiter is really great as a fight-focused commander. In this deck, we don't need to worry about space for creature removal, and we can work in some great enraged synergy like Raging Raptors or Siegehorn Ceratops, or Polyraptor. What's really cool about Waiter is the ability to move beyond the turn creature sideways win conditions, as she can enable all sorts of combo shenanigans, like pairing her with the Siegehorn and a Cacophodon. One activation gets the Siegehorn 4 counters and can untap both Waiter and a land, allowing us to repeat it as much as we want. Now add a Fling or a Chandra's Ignition into the mix, and one or all of your opponents are getting a visit from the Grim Reaper. Okay, let's go even more niche. What about becoming an actual paleontologist and discovering buried treasures in your graveyard? Now losing red is a bit of a kick in the teeth, but Alien Allen creates a whole different type of dinosaur deck. What if you play a Careful Study, and then discard an Apex Altasaur, and then exile it from your graveyard to discover 9? And what if you discover into an Expropriate? I think you get where I'm going, but there's all sorts of amazing, expensive non-creature spells that you can build around that can enable all sorts of interesting wins. Not bad for a dinosaur deck. If you're enjoying this, I cook up videos like this that help you think differently about Commander. Videos that help you build better decks, play better, and ultimately have more fun. If you want more of that, bite down on the like button to tell the algorithm that you think it's good, and subscribe to make sure that my next banger gets delivered directly into your eyeballs. Okay, once you've identified a good commander and the theme of your deck, I greatly advise not simply net decking or grabbing the most commonly used cards from a place like EDHREC. This is something that I've said before and is always true, but in this case it's especially relevant, because doing this will automatically make your deck like all the other average Typal decks with all the baggage that I talked about before. There is absolutely no harm in using these as an inspiration and taking elements from these places, but don't blindly follow what you see. I remember watching an interview with the creator of EDHREC where he talked about how and why they made it. He talked about how it was designed to give people a solid foundation on which they can then go and build to find interesting and novel things and to build interesting decks. A place you can go where, if you're building say a weighted deck, you can go and see the types of cards that people play and the kinds of things people do with them as a commander. Not to be the place that you blindly grab a list of 100 cards and call it a day. One of my passions outside of Magic the Gathering is teamfight tactics, and I have a great appreciation for Mortdog, its game designer. If you're not familiar with the game, it's an auto battler where you compile teams of units, and in many ways, it's similar to deck building in a trading card game, as you're effectively building a team with synergies and a core strategy in the same way that you would build a Magic deck. Mortdog regularly talks about game balance, and something that he often says about the game is that the data that they or we as players have only tells us what is, not what can be. And this resonates very well when we have a look at the information online or on tools like EDHREC about a given commander or deck. The collective groupthink, whilst a very useful tool, only tells you what others have already done, not what you can do or what is possible. So instead, whilst more difficult, especially if you're a newer player, I recommend focusing on what can be more than what is, and spending time to first think about what you want the deck to do and the experience that you want. Then go and use that lens to look at decks online and tools like EDHREC and spot the cards that play into what you're hoping to do. Remember that most of the people making decks that get fed into the data on a platform like EDHREC have the same or less experience playing Magic than you do. When you're deep into cooking mode with your Typal deck, one way you can definitely zig when everyone else is zagging is to focus on in-game states and win conditions that aren't necessarily reliant on just turning your creatures sideways. Or at least have interesting different ways of getting to that game-winning state. Waiter, who I mentioned in Dinosaurs, is a fantastic example of this, as they enable all sorts of interesting combos that will win the game without turning your creatures sideways. In some cases, this can align with what our creature type wants to do. If you're a pirate fan, it doesn't get much more piratey than Edward Kenway, who wants to board a ship and raid opponents. And who knows what manner of treasure you'll find and steal that could then create all sorts of interesting win conditions. Don Andres is equally eager to steal things, converting them to be his crew. Here a pirate deck is a lot less worried about being filled with pirates, but much more concerned about how you can get your opponent's creatures to commit to mutiny. Both of these simply show you how you can take what a creature type provides and use that to build a more interesting experience. Part of the reason I wanted to talk about Typal decks in relation to Lorwyn is because some of the card designs that I saw and how they help drive these decks in interesting directions. And I can't start this without talking about Perfect Morcant. Where most elf decks and cards are about being aggressive, Morcant's design encourages much more of a mid-range or control playstyle. As opposed to the most popular elf commander in Lathril, who wants to make lots of elves and then drain the table, Morcant gets the upper hand, by playing elves to drain opposing creatures of their power and toughness. Instead of life loss, we get to proliferate, draining those creatures even more. And this proliferate helps to open up all sorts of interesting cards that one can play, allowing us to tinker with 1/1 counters or other counters entirely. Now, I've deliberately not looked at the EDHREC page or content about her, but if I were to pursue whimsy with Morcant, I'd love to win with a card like the Millennium Calendar. Throw in cards like Branching Evolution, proliferate a bunch of times, and Doomsday is going to be approaching for our opponents real quick. From a thematic perspective, this could be a really interesting take on an arch-enemy style Golgari control deck, where you're stepping all over opponents and controlling the game, only to put a game-ending threat on the table and watching the table squirm as they approach impending doom. On the other hand, if we look at Boros, Kirill Attentive First Year could be the commander of a banger of a cleric deck. Boros certainly isn't the first color pairing that I think of when thinking about a cleric deck. But given clerics are a creature type with tons of interesting triggered abilities, I think this is the perfect fit. A very quick Scryfall search revealed cards like Minwu, Ondu Spirit Dancer, Mangara the Diplomat, Archivist of Ogma, Guide of Souls, Voice of Blessed, Bannon, Harsh Mentor, Hoffrey, and Venerable Warsinger. I'll leave you to explore the others if you like this idea, but we can lean heavily into life gain and aim to win the game via something like Test of Endurance or Philidar Sovereign, or even Aetherflux Reservoir. Last, but definitely not least, I want to talk about Ashling, the Elemental Precon, and some other great cards for the 99. I'm willing to bet that Ashling will be one of the most popular, if not the most popular commander from Lorwyn Eclipsed alongside Morcant. Partly because they're a Precon commander, and partly because they're absolutely broken. I think most Ashling decks that you come across are still going to win the game by turning creatures sideways, but I think how the deck gets to that game-ending board state and how quickly it's going to get there will look very different to the standard linear and incremental way that most Typal decks play. Ashling is cool because their evoke ability basically negates the need for a lot of colored mana in an otherwise 5-color deck, and abilities that only cost colorless mana open the door to cost reduction, enabling some truly broken things. For example, if we manage to get your cost reduction to 4 colorless mana, elementals are now free to evoke, allowing you to get their enters effect and creating a hasty token that sticks around to the end of the turn, free. A Maelstrom Wanderer's double 8 mana cascade is pretty broken at 8 mana, let alone at 4, and especially for 0 mana. This dynamic sets Ashling up as a deck that can play pretty much like a 0 to 100 combo deck, finding the right pieces and then creating a huge turn where the deck tries to win as long as we have a way to draw enough cards. I really like this design and find it far more interesting than other recent value-focused commanders like Pantlaza, where casting one thing simply gets us another thing. Beyond the commanders, Lorwyn Eclipsed also gives us fantastic cards for the 99 to facilitate less linear and boring Typal game plans. If we stay with Ashling Elementals and the Precon, we can look at the example of Jubilation. It can buff all of our hasty tokens by giving them +2/+2 and Trample. If we have Massive Mysteries out, it can give Myriad at the start of combat, and all of those hasty tokens will now get +6/+6 and Trample because of the Myriad tokens from the Jubilation. Not that I think we'll need it, but Sunderfoe can then remove all non-elemental creatures, so we're not getting blocked. Alternatively, what if we don't want to go the combat route? If we instead step outside of the Precon and into the Forests of Lorwyn for backup, we can recruit Enraged Flamecaster, which is basically a gutter snipe for large spells, and given most of our elementals will have high mana costs, that damage will rack up pretty quickly because they'll also trigger when we cast them for their evoke cost. If you want to make this even more spicy, we can bring in Champion of the Path, which will deal damage to the power of each elemental that enters to each opponent, which is a true game ender if ever I've seen one. And if you are somehow still worried about not doing enough damage, bring a Twin Flame Travelers along for the ride and double both your Flamecaster or Champion triggers, and then you are truly cooking. I'm sure you get the gist of where I'm going, but I'm a huge fan of the direction that many of the cards in Lorwyn have gone for how they will support Typal themes, new ideas, many of which will allow a Typal deck to play out differently and in ways that aren't solely reliant on combat damage. Long may it continue. With all this said, if you take some of the guidance that I've shared here and think about the interesting things that your creature type can enable, rather than those creatures being the interesting thing, you're already on the right path. I feel it's important to call out that I obviously haven't gone into lots of technical detail or direction about how to build a good Magic deck, but that's because I feel like I've done that in tons of other videos, and I will drop some of those down in the description. So as a part of this video, Magic the Gathering provided me with this Ashling Precon to check out and tinker with. Now that I've put it through its paces, I'm going to be giving it a few base deck department upgrades, and I'd like to give it away to one of you to enjoy at your tables. Check out the description or the pinned comment if you'd like to enter. I hope you found this useful, and I'd love to hear your takes about interesting Typal decks that you've built that deviate from the norm. If you want to support what I do, smash up the like button or head over to my Patreon. And a big thank you to everyone that supports me over there. If you want some personal tailored help, or you're just horribly rich and want to jettison some money, you can find that over on Ko-fi, all of which you can find the links to down below the like button. If you like this and want more of the same, or you want some technical know-how, you may like one of these videos. As always, thank you for being here.